Hey y'all, hi. I'm Hannah. I am a writer and I make YouTube videos about consumerism and aesthetics. And I also happen to have had a baby last year. I decided not to shift the focus of my YouTube channel onto parenthood. Until today, I actually haven't made a single YouTube video specific to the experience of parenthood, and the chances are good that I will never do that again. So if you watch most of my videos, but watching a video like this isn't going to make you feel good, please just skip it. I totally understand. If you like my work, but you're not into this, don't fret. But a couple of months after I came back from parental leave, I filmed my birth story for Patreon, and I thought it would stay on Patreon, which is behind a paywall. I'll put a pinned comment about Patreon down below, so you can read that if you don't know what it is. It was the lovely comments of some of my patrons on that birth story video on Patreon that made me want to share it more widely. They made me realize that before giving birth, I would have loved to see someone else's story told this way. I did a lot of research and reading and preparation, and I did uncover some birth stories that did help me some, but they all felt kind of niche and out of the way. And given the number of people who give birth on this planet, I mean, given that for every person now walking around, somebody went through some version of this, it is bizarre that there are not more accessible stories. So now, 6 months later, I am briefly straying from the usual topics of my channel and posting that original footage here on YouTube. Before we roll that footage, I want to say that if I had known that this would eventually become a YouTube video, I would absolutely have made an outline and organized the information in a more linear way, and I would have exfoliated my lips before turning on the camera. I'm kind of a mess in this footage. My Patreon self, it's kind of like if you showed up at my house before breakfast and we were chatting at my kitchen table. So it's crunchy. But there's absolutely no way that I could go back and tell this story now and manage to capture the full impact of how it was, even for the sake of doing it in a more organized way. Because my past self, my Patreon self, my 6 months ago self, it was much fresher in her mind when she was telling the story. So this is it. This is the relic that we have. It's messy, but hopefully it will have something to offer you in its messiness. And without further ado, let us get into the meat of this video. Hi, patrons. Hi. Okay, I'm doing it. I have to put on makeup to get ready to film new makeup hot takes, and I'm going to do the birth story. So, disclaimer. That's what this whole video is going to be. I'm just going to be talking about how labor and delivery ended up unfolding for me. And I am going to remember to get ready while I'm doing it, starting with a little primer. I'll try to let you know what I'm doing as I go through as well. This is Merit Great Skin. My skin has been not great lately, I feel, not taking makeup as well as I wish that it would. So this kind of thing's been really helping. So the reason that I feel, I think birth is one of those things, it's like if you never go through it and you're never adjacent to it, you think of it as this sort of foggy specter, like maybe you have ideas from film and television, but you might never get that far into figuring out or getting the information to help you kind of crystallize in your mind what it could actually be like and what the many factors might be. So I think that it's kind of interesting for that reason. And as I got more and more pregnant, I started being like, whoa, I need to do some research and sort of prepare myself for what the reality might be. So it's interesting on that level. And that's one of the reasons that I think people are asking, for the story. But it's also, once you do start doing the research, you find out that it can go, there are so many ways that it can go, especially these days. And there are a lot of choices to be made about what you want to have happen and what you hope to have happen. And then the most prevalent and best piece of advice that people give about giving birth is that you should not expect it to go the way that you hope that it will go. So you have your literal birth plan, which we actually typed up, but plan is sort of in quotation marks. It's, preferences, like things that you hope that the nurses and doctors will take into account so that you can kind of all be on the same team when you're there and you're trying to make one of any of the many decisions that need to be made when you're going through the process. Because at every step of the way, you can kind of choose X or Y, you know what I mean? Like choose this or that. Then there are some things that you will only have to choose if the contingency arises. So this might happen and then you might have to choose between this and that. And then there are things that you might make a choice, but there's the question of like, how strongly do you feel? So the big looming one is the question of whether or not to get an epidural. And there's the hope that there's either the decision that you will or the hope that you won't. You can make that decision beforehand. But then there's kind of this in-between thing, which is like, how strongly do you feel about the decision that you've made? So if you've decided that you are going to try to do it without an epidural, which is, I think a lot of people know, but it's like a spinal tap that numbs your body from the waist down so you don't feel the contractions anymore and you don't feel the baby being born, like the pushing and burning part. Which reminds me to say that I am not, especially, well, I've never been like this, but especially after having gone through it, I don't really have like a shyness or awkwardness filter around like gross stuff or body stuff. I'm just gonna be talking about it. And if you are worried that it might feel weird, just know it's earthy. Prepare yourself for some earthiness. That's all. I'm using the RMS foundation because all I've been using is the Natasha Denona, and I want to mix it up a little bit. I want to like get back, because I think I need to do an end of year declutter. So I'm trying to get back in touch with some of the things that I know that I really like and that I just haven't been using and I've sort of forgotten about. So what I was saying is that with this question of pain medication, the primary choice for people who want to use it these days being an epidural, there's sort of this question of like, if you decide that you want to opt out of that and feel all of the sensations as you're giving birth, how serious are you about sticking to that in extremity? So I think some people are like, no, I don't want an epidural and I feel really strongly about it. And no matter what I say when I'm in there, don't let me get it. And some are like, well, I think I want to try to not get it, but I have no idea what it's going to be like. And there's a very good chance that I might change my mind once I'm in labor. So those two ways of approaching wanting not to have an epidural are vastly different. You know what I mean? Those are two vastly different approaches. So it's not enough when preparing for birth to just mark down on your birth sheet, do I want an epidural, YN, circle 1. You know what I mean? Like you have to be even a little more specific, especially for the person who's going to be helping you, which in my case was Joe, just Joe. I mean, we decided he would be my doula. He really, really prepared. He read everything I read. We talked a lot about it. We made the birth plan together. I think I would have liked to have a doula. I even contacted a couple people. A doula is someone who doesn't work for the hospital, someone who you hire just to kind of be your support person. And the idea is, and the reason that so many people love having doulas is it's like somebody who knows about the process. Because with Joe as my one support person, we were aware that no matter how well he prepared, he was also going to be doing this for the first time. And if you have a doula there with you, you have someone who has done it many times and who's just there to support you and to help you have as positive a birth experience as you can possibly have. So a doula is a great thing. I thought that I would get one. Frankly, they're so expensive in my area. Thousands and thousands of dollars, like so expensive. And so I was a little bit lackluster in my attempts to find a doula. Like I emailed a couple of people, didn't get any emails back, and then we kind of just stopped trying. And as it got closer to the date, it was like, well, I guess that we're going to try to just do it, just the two of us. And that is what we did. So Joe knew not only that I was hoping to be able to feel all of the sensations of giving birth. He knew not only that I was hoping that I would make it through in that spirit and that I would continue to have that be my choice all the way through, rather than changing my mind and getting an epidural. He knew that, and he also knew that I felt pretty strongly about it. And what I wrote in the birth plan was, I was like, if I'm halfway through labor and I say I want an epidural, I didn't want anyone to question me. I didn't want anyone to be like, are you sure? You said you didn't. You can do it. I was like, if I say it, if I'm in there and I'm in pain and I'm like, I've decided I want an epidural, don't question me. I will only say it if I truly mean it. But if I don't say it, don't offer. I was like, I didn't want anyone in there when I was having contractions being like, do you want an epidural? I just wanted it to be like, we're not doing it. And unless I got to the point where I was like, no, I think we are doing it. So that's pretty specific. So that was written in the birth plan. And Joe also knew that. And we had talked about all of my reasons for not wanting it. And I'm not going to go too much into detail. I mean, I could write a whole book. Like anyone, I think, could write literally like a 500-page book about their own birth plan and their own birth experience. And we just can't be here for that long of a video. But what I'll say is that my main reason was wanting to feel the feelings. Like I wanted to be able to feel the baby in the birth canal. And I wanted to feel what it was like to push. So brief primer, and I'm going to keep going. That foundation is beautiful. I'm going to keep it in the declutter and I'm going to keep using it. I feel like I don't really need any concealer, but I do want my skin to look pretty seamless right now because my hair is so pulled back. Do a little bit more concealing. There are stages of labor. So the first one, early labor, can go on for days. It's like your body is sort of starting to go into labor. Pre-labor, actually. I think for me, pre-labor went on. I'm now realizing that it's 3 months ago. It feels so foggy. I hope that I can remember the details and I don't give you any misinformation. So pre-labor is like your body is actively preparing and labor is coming, but that can go on for days, sometimes even weeks. I mean, it varies dramatically widely. And I think my body was in pre-labor for quite a long time. Like I could feel things were happening. I could feel it shifting. And Felix had his head way down. It's like the baby dropping is what it's called. Basically putting the head right at the entrance to the birth canal, like really, really ready. With first babies, it often happens in the week or two before labor. And then I believe with second and third babies, they don't usually drop until right before you go into labor or even during labor. But Felix was like, I think it was like weeks. Like his head was shoved down in there. And every time I went in for an exam, the last couple exams, which towards the end was like every week, the doctor would do a cervical check and she was like, oh, I can feel his head like right on the other side of your cervix. Like she was like touching his head because it was so far down. So I kept feeling like I was going to go into labor and my due date passed. It was 5 days past my due date before I went into labor. And I just felt like it was any minute for so long. It felt like so long to me. And my body was really like starting to get in the zone. That's kind of the only way that I can describe it or now remember it. It felt like there was something in the air kind of in me. The second stage of labor is early labor, where you're having contractions, but they're far apart. Oh, and the other thing about pre-labor is braxton hicks contractions, which is where your contractions are happening. And I didn't really know this, but it's like, how can I describe it? Now it feels like common knowledge to me, but I didn't know any of this before. The baby is like, as I described it before, like a cat inside a water balloon. Like if you imagine a large water balloon with a cat inside of it, like moving, or a kitten, moving around. And usually it's like the skin of the stomach is a bit loose and then there's all this liquid and the creature inside. And when you have a contraction, the skin tightens, like as if it's like, almost as if you sucked a bunch of the water out and the skin tightened around the kitten and you could like see the outline of its bones. And then it relaxes and it's like the water is rushed back in. Of course, the water hasn't gone actually anywhere when this actually happens, but that's sort of what it is like. That's what it feels like, but it's not painful. And it's the body kind of getting used to. What I learned is that the way that it works, I found this also fascinating. I hope this isn't too much detail. The cervix is closed and it's connected to the uterus, kind of like the uterus is a balloon with the cervix at the bottom closed up tight. And the uterus, when you're pregnant, it stretches out a lot and the actual cells lengthen like that. They're all lengthened, the cells. When you have a contraction, every cell in the uterus literally contracts, like bunches up. And so the entire thing, like a net around the baby, gets smaller. As I was describing, I don't know why I used like a balloon and a cat when a uterus and a baby is like, you can visualize it just like that. So all of the cells bunch up, and as they bunch up, they pull the cervix apart. This happens during braxton hicks contractions in the weeks leading up to birth. They tug at the cervix when the braxton hicks contraction happens, and all of the literal cells of the uterus bunch up and make it all smaller. They gently tug and tug and tug the cervix so that it gets willing to open. And as you get closer and closer to actual labor, it starts opening a little bit. Like you get a little bit dilated even before you go into labor, during pre-labor. And it also gets thinner because it's being stretched. It gets thinner that way, which is called effacement. So it gets soft and it softens, right? It gets softer, thinner, and the braxton hicks contractions pull it apart. It makes so much sense, but I read so many books about giving birth and only one of them included this information about the cells of the uterus contracting and helped me put these pieces together that helped me understand that contractions, the way this book, which was called Mindful Birthing, and one of you recommended it. I'm so glad that I'm coming back to say this. One of you recommended this book and I can't remember and I don't know how to search like for the comment or something. Thank you so much. This book, and my friend Liz, who's a midwife, had also recommended it, but I had forgotten. I'm totally failing to put on makeup. So when you recommended it, I was like, oh yeah, Liz had recommended that book and I got it and it single-handedly made my birth experience what it was. I cannot thank you enough. That book was everything to me because it helped to knit together the meditation practice that I had been engaged in for months leading up to giving birth, it helped to knit that together and the skills that I had gained from that practice, to knit those skills together with the actual physical reality of giving birth, which I needed. That's exactly what I needed. It was the missing piece, and it was everything to me. And anyone who ever thinks they might give birth ever, I recommend reading that book actually at the very beginning. I came to it kind of late in my pregnancy, but because I'd been meditating the whole time, I had the skills, I had the tools, so I was able to apply them. All right, browse. We're going with a refi. So Mindful Birthing was the book that explained to me that a contraction is also an expansion, and to think of it that way. I mean, I think people do think like, oh, contractions push the baby out. But it's not that simple. Contractions pull the cervix apart. A contraction is actually an opening. It's a way, it's your body opening and making way for the baby. I love that. And it helps so much to think about it that way, because contraction is like this closing and tightening and pain thing, but expansion is like this breathing and opening and making way thing, which is truly what it is, and just much easier to hold on to when you are anticipating it and afraid that it's going to hurt, and also when you're actually going through it and it does hurt. So in the weeks leading up to giving birth, I was having all these braxton hicks contractions constantly, and my cervix was softening and being very gently teased apart, which we knew from the checks every week when I went in to see my OB. So everything was happening as it should. And then we were days past the due date. Every day I thought I was going to go into labor. And I was expecting to go into early labor and to know that it was happening for quite a long time. Because when you read about early labor, you read that it can go on for like a day. And usually contractions start, a real contraction, so it feels like the braxton hicks, but it's painful. They start like 30 minutes apart, maybe 40 minutes apart, and they're painful, but they're not so painful that they're like, you can't speak through them, or you can't walk through them, you can't live your life. So I'd read all of these stories about labor starting, and then you're like, oh, I'm going into labor, but the contractions aren't close enough together and they're not painful enough to warrant going to the hospital. So I'm going to go to the grocery store, maybe go to a movie, have a nice dinner, try to get some sleep, take a long bath, stay at home as long as possible, sometimes for 24 hours. And then when the contractions are very close to, they get progressively closer together. And that's how you can tell you're in real labor and not just braxton hicks. When the contractions are, going from 20 minutes to 19 minutes apart or 15 minutes apart over time, and the contractions themselves are getting a little bit longer and a little bit more intense. But for most people, they start really far apart and they get closer together really slowly over the course of many, many hours. So I was planning to stay at home as long as possible. I wanted to labor at home for as long as possible. I wanted to labor in the bath. There wasn't a birthing tub at the place that we were going. And, we're self-employed, so we just have like the insurance that we can afford. And we don't have very many choices. We just had to go to the hospital that was the one that our insurance would cover. And there were no tubs there. I couldn't go to a birthing center or anything because it wouldn't have been covered. So I wanted to stay at home for as long as possible. I wanted to labor in the bathtub because that's my happy place. And I know that being in the tub calms my nervous system. And this is another thing that I had learned partly from Julia Frodal during all the meditation stuff, but also from mindful birthing. I hadn't learned about it rebirth from Julia, but I had learned to be thinking about the impact of the nervous system on an experience and on life. And I'd been thinking about that a lot. I learned from mindful birthing that the nervous system, the potential fight or flight response really can impact your labor and delivery experience, because evolutionarily, if you're in danger, labor should stop. Like if you are a cave woman and you go into labor and then you see a tiger, your labor should stop long enough for you to get away and get safe. And what many people report experiencing is that they labor at home for some time and then they go to the hospital and labor slows down significantly for several hours. So the contractions don't progress and it can be very discouraging. Like you get in the hospital room and it's like nothing's happening. Like you continue to have contractions, but you're not, and they're painful and it's really challenging and you're not getting anywhere and it goes on for hours and hours. I know from talking to friends and from reading about it that that's when it can get discouraging and you get really tired, discouraging and difficult to the point that you're like, I need something to help me through this. I can't keep going. And having gone through contractions, I can totally understand how that happens. I mean, it would be excruciating to have it be just dragging out for like a day and not progressing. And I had read about, in mindful birthing, the relationship between the progression of contractions and the nervous system and the fight or flight response. And so I was thinking a lot about downregulating the nervous system, staying as calm as possible and not letting the fact of going into labor freak me out, or the new experience of going to the hospital in this context freak me out, in order to try to avoid that kind of like slowing down or halting of labor. Because I was following the guidance of this book kind of to a T, and I really, really bought into what this book was saying. Now, I feel like here is where I need to say that there are so many factors that go into the way that a labor progresses, and there's so much that's totally out of your control. And I was aware, even as I was trying to plan for this and thinking a lot about this and strategizing, that I might try to do everything, I might succeed at doing everything that I was planning and still have a halt to my labor when I got to the hospital, still have it drag out for hours, or still have something go really wrong or be really scary and have to get an emergency C-section or something. It happens all the time. It happens to so many people. And the fact that it ended up working for me in this situation with this exact flavor, this exact baby, is so much chance. Like, it's so much just up to luck. And I'm fully aware of that. So I don't want it to sound like, oh, I manifested this like really relatively good birth experience, all things considered, because I read the right thing and I planned and I meditated and all. I don't want it to sound like that, because I know that most of it was just sheer grace. And I feel really lucky about that, really grateful. I'm just trying to give you the story, because part of the story was that I was reading about this stuff and thinking about this stuff, and it was what was helping me feel prepared. So I hope that is enough of a distinction, because I know that there are a lot of you out there who've gone through this or who will go through this, and you know that it's like the best laid plans usually don't bear fruit in this situation, right? The only thing you can do is just be prepared for anything and let go of control. In my case, I was really thinking a lot about downregulating the nervous system, not letting the fight or flight response kick in. And that's why, to go all the way back to what set me off on this tangent, that's why I wanted to labor in the bath. Because to me, a bathtub is the thing. Hot water is the thing that is the most effective at calming my nervous system. And it's just always been like that. So I had big plans that once I realized I was in real labor, I would spend as much time as possible in the bathtub, and that we would wait as long as possible before going to the hospital. I wanted the contractions to be so close together and so painful that my system was screaming, like, you have to go now. Don't wait any longer. You have to go now. The advice is wait until you really feel like you're in full and active labor, and then wait a little bit longer before you go. And I totally planned to do that. I was hoping that most of it would be at home, because I don't like hospitals. And I also felt that transition from home to the hospital was going to be the dicey moment for the nervous system. And I wanted to put that off as long as possible until my body was like really in active labor, to maximize my chances that we would just like keep on going through that transition and just sort of finish it off in the hospital. So we had packed a bag. We were prepared. We were very prepared, because we had extra time. Days past the due date. They say that you should have it packed like 2 weeks before the due date, I think, maybe even a month. Boy, did we ever have it packed. And I had printed out our birth plan. I had printed out all of my favorite long poems for Joe to read to me, because, again, I was thinking a lot about like staying in the mind. Like, how can I explain it? Staying in my mindfulness place, like in the safety of myself inside my body, and not letting the thinking mind go wild and range around like the physical space that I was in. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. You know that this is it. This is what is going to explain what I was sort of trying to prepare for. You know that scene in A Wrinkle in Time when they're on the planet with the machine or whatever it is. It's been a long time since I read it, but there's this evil machine that's trying to take their minds over, the kids, trying to brainwash them, basically. And they are feeling the pull of the of the machine on their minds. They're feeling this sort of like rhythmic lulling, trying to suck them in. And what they do is they start reciting things like the ABCs and nursery rhymes, and they start disrupting the lull of this machine, this rhythmic sucking away of the brain, by reciting songs and rhymes and things that they know that come from themselves and like push back against the seduction of that brainwashing. So to me, the seduction, the equivalent of the seduction of the brainwashing in the moment of being in labor, I was imagining would be fear and panic and pain, like giving into the panic that pain can cause. And also the fear that can be triggered by being in a hospital setting and it being unfamiliar, and the worry that things are going to go wrong, being in unfamiliar hands, just the general feelings that are a reaction to the medical system and all of that. I didn't want to let all of that brainwash me in the moment and take over. And so I was thinking about things that I could prepare that would ground me in myself and in my own brain and body and heart, kind of. And that's where I came up with the idea of having Joe read to me these poems: The Walrus and the Carpenter, Directive by Robert Frost, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock was one of them, In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden was one of them. And there are probably a couple of others, but I can't remember right now. There are these poems that I basically have memorized. And so I knew that him reading them would call up my own knowledge of them, and it would give me something to stick to kind of in extremity, right? So I had these like folders printed out. I had written a bunch of reminders to myself based on what I learned from mindful birthing and my meditation practice. So I had like the birth plan for the nurse to read so she would know what kind of labor and delivery we were hoping for. But I also had my own personal birth plan with like notes to myself of things to remember at different stages. So all of that was packed and prepared, and clothes and stuff for the hospital. And yet we thought that we would still have a lot of runway, because everything that I'd read says like you'll know for a long time that you're going into labor, and there will be all of this time in between contractions when you can just live your normal life, prepare yourself mentally, physically, and logistically, like finishing packing and stuff. Prepare yourself before they gradually get close enough, the contractions, that you're in so much pain that you can't walk or talk through them. And that's when you should call. And you shouldn't even call before then, because they just will say, don't come in yet. You're not in active enough labor yet. So that's what we were expecting. Here's what happened. I got to do some eye makeup. I don't know where my eye... Oh, it's right here. My eye primer. I couldn't find it upstairs because it was down here. I want to do a very light, slightly enhancing eye look for New Makeup Hot Takes, because Machete just sent me these earrings, and I like that. I feel like they'll go well with a lip that kind of goes with them. So I don't want too much on the eyes. It was 5 days after the due date. It was about actually I know exactly what time it was, 1:50 in the morning. We'd gone to sleep. We'd gone out to dinner, this really lovely sort of Mexican street food restaurant. I had eaten, will become relevant in a minute. I had eaten this amazing meal of like duck tacos with shredded cabbage and all the fixins. I'm using the Natasha Denona Glam palette. A strong contraction woke me up at 1:50 in the morning. And I had been having strong Braxton Hicks contractions. I had one very strong painful contraction at some point, like a week or two earlier. It was strong enough to wake me up, though, and that was a little unusual. So I woke up and I was like, and I checked the time. I think it was exactly 20 minutes later. No, it can't have been. It was 15 minutes later. It was 15, because I remember it was 2:05 or like 2:04 or something. So it had been 15 minutes. I had another contraction. And I was like, okay, 15 minutes. That's pretty far apart. And I was like, well, if this is really labor, I mean, I wasn't thinking any of this stuff. I was just, because I had been thinking I was going into labor for so long, so many times, and it hadn't happened. So all I was thinking was, I was like, I had what felt like a contraction at 1:50, and now it's 2:05, and I just had another one. 10 minutes later, I had another one that was pretty strong. And I was like, and they were like hurting, 8 minutes later, I had another one. I remember we got to close to 2:30 and the contractions had gone from 15 minutes to 10 minutes to 8 minutes apart consecutively, which is extremely rapid progression. The normal thing is to have like them to be 20 minutes apart for a day, you know? And it was really starting to be intense. So that was when I woke Joe up and I was like, I'm having contractions there. The last one was 8 minutes apart. Yeah. He woke up. The next one was like 5 minutes later. He started getting up. It was getting really intense. And I started almost immediately, what do they call it in mindful birthing? Sounding. It's like where you make an ohm, you know, the ohm, like that's an example of sounding, but it can be any sound. This is kind of what I was doing. And the idea of the theory behind, I'm never going to get my makeup done. It is both a thing that kind of happens spontaneously and a thing that is very healthy to do because of the nervous system. So a low moan like that helps the nervous system sort of ground and slow, as opposed to a high pitched noise like a screech or a scream that kind of tells it's like your body telling your brain that there's something really wrong. Whereas a low comforting sound is your body telling your brain that it's okay. And I had read about it and I had thought, that's so embarrassing. It was like these like low cow sounds. I was like, I'll probably end up doing that, but it's so embarrassing. The book suggests that you practice it and that you and your birthing partner practice it together. And I was like, we're not doing that. Like it was too embarrassing even to practice. And then there I was, not half an hour into labor, like on my hands and knees on our bed, like really sounding. Joe had probably been awake for 8 to 10 minutes or something. And then I was like, I think I'm going to throw up. And I promptly went into the bathroom and threw up everything that I had eaten, like in the previous half a day. The dinner, all of it, and like everything else that I had eaten, which is something that happens. And I had read about it. What it is that when you go into labor, your digestive system stops. So if there's food in your body that hasn't gotten far enough along in digestion, your body will eject it because it's like, oh, we don't have time for this. Like we're not going to be able to process this and take in this nutrition. And we don't want all of this food in here just sitting here. Ain't nobody got time for this. Eject. It was so forceful and so biological. And I mean, I think this is like the incredible thing about going through an experience like this. It's like the body knows the wisdom of the body, which I try in my day-to-day life to be in tune with. And I've worked so hard in my life to appreciate, to respect, and to listen to. In moments like this, I mean, this is true for all of pregnancy, but it reared up when I went into labor and it just asserted itself to be in the grip of the knowledge of the body like that and to be completely your brain, whatever you think you have, whatever we foolish contemporary humans think, like our intelligence or our technology or whatever has on the body. It's just your doubts are wiped away in that moment. And it was just incredible to physically be swept away, you know, physically, mentally, emotionally, chemically, like everything just taken over. And that was like the first wild, magnificent sign of it. And I couldn't believe it because I didn't feel sick. Like it wasn't like other kinds of throwing up I've done in my life. It was just my body was suddenly like, and now we're doing this. And also, you know, I was having contractions, which I don't know how to explain it. It was explained to me as like menstrual cramps times 1,000. If you've had menstrual cramps in your life, and that is a pretty good analogy. It was pretty localized for me too. I was terrified of back labor, which is when the cramps really wrap all the way around to the back and you have intense lower back pain. It can be caused because of, you know, the position of the baby or just your specific body. And I think that for many people, back labor, like back pain is so intense and it's so scary. I feel like there's actually a really intense panic response that gets triggered from back pain more than almost any other kind of pain. I think that for a lot of people who hope not to use an epidural or another kind of pain medication, but then they end up choosing to, it's because of back labor, which is what it's called when your back is in intense pain during contractions. It wasn't like that for me, which was the first of many really amazing gifts, I think, that from this experience that allowed it to be what it was. It was pretty localized for me across my front. But it was like menstrual cramps times 1,000. And the whole body gets into it. You know what I mean? Like your whole body is sort of taken over by it, but the pain is there. So that was going on. I think my water broke, which was another huge surprise because my mom, when I was born, had the sac, that is what breaks when your water breaks, was so thick and strong that they had to break it manually. That happened when my sister was born too. And then my mom found out that that had happened for her mother with all of her 4 children. So I had this idea that I was genetically predisposed to having like a really thick water sac and that it wouldn't break basically until labor was almost all the way over. I was sure that I wasn't going to be one of those 10% of people whose water breaks at the beginning of labor, like as the start of labor. It's only a very small percentage of people for whom labor begins like that. But I realized as I was scrambling to try to get dressed in between intense, painful, long, strong contractions that were only like 4 to 5 minutes apart. By half an hour in, they were like 4 to 5 minutes apart. I hadn't even gotten myself together. All I had done was like get out of bed and throw up everything I'd ever eaten. So I was trying to get dressed. I was trying to like think, and just get dressed for the hospital. In between that, I was like, I'm leaking. I was like, fluid is leaking everywhere. And I was so out of it because the thing is, the oxytocin, the drugs that the body produces are magnificent. And this was another thing I learned from mindful birthing that was so helpful to me. I think I might have indicated this a little bit, talked about this a little bit in a Patreon video before. I learned from this book and also from another book, Childbirth, what is it called? Pregnancy, Childbirth, and the Newborn, that during labor, you have these contractions, which, are every 20 minutes, every 15 minutes, every 10 for a long time, and then for most people, and then when labor gets really active, they get closer together. So 4 or 5 minutes, 3 to 2 minutes apart, as you get closer and closer to the final phase or the transition phase and then the final phase. When you're having a contraction, you're in intense pain. For most people, it's the worst pain they've ever felt or will ever feel. Physical pain when you're having the contraction. But when you're not having one, you're not in pain. It's not like the pain stays. You go from being in this intense pain to having compared to the length of the contractions, quite a long break from it, in between. And not only are you not in pain in between the contractions, but your body is producing such intense drugs. The way that one of the books explained it was that how high you are basically when you're in labor is something that people pay a lot of money to feel. Like it's like the best drugs. People like seek that feeling and you're getting it for free because your body is producing those drugs from inside. If you can let go of the feelings that you might have about pain because you were just in it and keep yourself from panicking as you anticipate being in pain again very shortly and just be in your body in between contractions, it can actually feel amazing because you feel so good when you're not having a contraction. And I knew this going in, right? This was that concept was the foundation of my personal birth plan. My plan for getting through it was to let go of the past and not anticipate the future in between contractions so that I would spend percentage-wise the majority of the time feeling good because percentage-wise, you spend more time not having a contraction than you do having a contraction. So that was my plan. And the reason I brought it up just now was to say that I already felt so on drugs. Like I was out of my mind, not because of the pain, but because all of these hormones are coursing through my body and just making me feel dizzy. I mean, underwater and euphoric and dizzy and foggy-headed and just like I was passing out in a field of poppies in Wizard of Oz, you know what I mean? In between the contractions. But it was in between the contractions that I had to be doing stuff like getting dressed and, as it turned out, changing my underwear. I kept changing my underwear because I was like, oh my gosh, my underwear is like soaked through with fluid. This is so weird. And then I would change it. And then a couple minutes later, I'd be like, my underwear is soaked through fluid. It's so weird. And so it just tells you how like on drugs I was. Finally, kind of the other shoe dropped and I was like, oh, I think this might be amniotic fluid leaking out. As it transpired, what had happened, I think, is that it was starting to leak. It was starting to come apart, right? But Felix's head was so far down that it was like blocking a rush of fluid from coming out. And so it was just starting to like leak down around his head and trickle out. But it was enough so that I like kept having to change my underwear. I had a bunch of period underwear, thank goodness, because that was the only solution. I had to wear that because it was just like I was leaking from the get-go. Leaking fluid. So right away, all these things I didn't expect were happening. My water was breaking, contractions were coming thick and fast. There was no time. And Joe was with me for every contraction. So eventually I got dressed. We made our way downstairs to the living room. I was continuing to sound like a cow, like low and groan. Some of the contractions were harder than or worse than others, but they would progressively, they were getting more and more intense. I was continuing to make these really loud, low noises to get myself through. And Joe also was there helping me breathe through each one. And they were getting close together. And we finally were like, he was running around doing other things. He was getting himself dressed. And we were finally like, oh my gosh, we have to get ready. We have to pack the car. He brought our stuff he managed to bring all of our bags down from upstairs and this yoga ball, which we had all these preparations. It can be good for the spine and the pelvis and for pain and for just shaking the baby out to labor on a yoga ball. One of those, you know what a yoga ball is. You sit up on it and move around. And I had already been using one because I was having a bunch of tailbone pain. I'd been using one as my office chair. So we had to get the yoga ball in the car. We had to get all of the suitcases and stuff in the car, the bags, and we had brought a blanket and, But he did all of that, but stopping every 2 to 3 minutes to come to me and be with me through the contraction because I needed him, So it was he would be getting, and we had a food bag. He would be in the kitchen putting coconut water into the food bag. And I would be like, Joe, another contraction starting. He'd run in and he would be with me and he would run back and continue doing what he was doing. He was incredible. It was a feat to manage to get us all ready to go and also be with me every time. And he managed it. There wasn't a single one where I was alone having a contraction and trying to get through it on our couch or something. It was he was there. I don't know how he did it. But he managed. We called. I threw up again and there wasn't much left, but I threw up again at some point. We called, and what happens is, at least here, it's there's this hotline you call and then they're kind of suspicious. They're don't come in if you're not really in labor. Really don't. And they ask you all these questions how far apart are the contractions? How hard are they? And I think they're also kind of listening to your voice, how on drugs are you? They're kind of trying to make sure that you're really, really beyond before they authorize you to come in. And we knew that. So we waited until it was the contractions were, I think they were 3 minutes to call. And the nurse on the hotline asked me a bunch of questions and I answered them. And then I had another contraction while we were on the phone and she was okay, you can come in. She called the hospital to see if they were ready, if they had space and to make sure that was the right place to go. Because if it had been totally full, they would have sent us somewhere else. But the hospital that we thought we would be going to had room. She was go ahead and go to the hospital. And I was thank God, because I just knew. And it was the book, I think it's Mindful Birthing, that was wait until you're in active labor before you go to the hospital and then wait a little longer. Wait if you can. But also if you ever think we need to go now, then just go, regardless of what anyone says. That's what it said in the book. And that's what I had written a note to myself that said that. And at that moment, it had all happened so fast because it was probably, it was 2:00 when I woke up and it was probably around 4:00 at this time. It was just a couple of hours, but to me, it felt like it happened so fast. And I was feeling that way. I was we have to go now. If the woman had been maybe you should wait another hour, I would have been girl, this baby is about to come out. I just need, no, you don't understand. I'm really laboring. I knew that it was time to go. So I'm really glad that she believed us. So we went to the hospital. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to say about the pre-hospital times. It might have been another hour. It might have added up to ending up to be 3 hours. In my memory, it was 20 seconds that we were at home, but it might have been a little longer than that. I spent a long time laboring on the couch, having contractions, but it was as long as it took us to get ourselves together to be ready to go. And then we called pretty much. So it feels like no time passed at all because there was no time to do anything. This is the last thing I was going to say. The idea of taking a bath was completely out the window. Taking a bath at home, absolutely not. There was just no time, no capacity. It just felt like I was on the top of a long slide and I had been pushed over the edge and I was sliding down the slide. And I was just we are just going, one thing after another. We were just going. And I was so on drugs and the contractions were so intense and I was in them all the time, and it was just all-consuming, completely all-consuming with no space for anything in between. So we got in the car. We drove to the hospital. We pulled up. The guy took one look at me, the intake guy, and he was okay. And he brought the wheelchair around, and he told Joe had to park the car and then come in another way. He told Joe where to meet me. This was the only time that I was separated from Joe for the entire thing. And this guy, this kind and very efficient young man started wheeling me through the hospital. And I had a bunch of contractions in the car. As soon as I got in that chair and he started wheeling me, started having a contraction. I remember being like, what's your name? This is when the thing that was for me a major feature of the experience started, which is that I closed my eyes, I shut everything out, and I went into my mind space. Like I went into that like meditative place. I was in mindful birthing. It says, I think that's where I read this, to not allow the thinking mind to take over. It's something like that. I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something about not allowing the thinking mind to run the show. So it's sort of, again, like that thing from A Wrinkle in Time, like I didn't want to give even the tiniest slice of my consciousness and the experience of my body. I didn't want to make room for anything that didn't need to be in my experience to get in. I don't know if that made sense. I was trying to like surround myself with myself and not let anything in, basically, because I didn't want the thinking mind to like take in new information, cause a thinking mind to start turning it over, like needing to process and to work on processing it. And I didn't want that to happen. So I got in the wheelchair, I closed my eyes, and y'all, I think I opened my eyes a total of maybe 3 to 4 times from that moment through to the end. I completely went inside. Maybe a couple more times than that, but I would just like squint them open a tiny bit. And then I got into that chair and I just went into myself. And it was that nervous system thing. Like I was just trying not to tell my nervous system, my body, that we were in a new place, that it was a hospital, I was trying to like pad my body from that, the harshness, the light, the strangeness, the smells, like everything, and just be in. So I had my eyes closed, but I also felt I wanted to be, a thing that I couldn't shut out was like human connection. So I remember being in this hospital and this man wheeling me fast through the hospital. And he was wheeling me so fast that I could feel breeze blowing on my face. And that felt really great. So I was like this wild drugged person sitting in the chair, feeling the breeze like blowing my hair. And I was like, what's your name? And he was like, Daniel. And I was like, okay, Daniel, thank you. And then I started having contraction and I was like, I'm having contractions pretty frequently, so I'm not that. And then it was like, moo. I was like mooing as poor Daniel like wheeled me into an elevator. I felt like I wanted to connect with him. You know what I mean? I didn't want to be like just totally impersonal. But that was all I could do. I had a couple contractions and then he dropped me off at the check-in. He was taking me to check in to the hospital alone while I was having contractions like every 2 minutes and mooing like a cow. And I was like, thank you, Daniel. I just remember being like, thank you, Daniel. And then he left me and I had to check in with this, get a bracelet. You know, I had my ID and stuff. So I was sitting on a chair. It's hard to recall the details. Wow, I'm getting really detailed. I hope this isn't totally boring. I was sitting on a chair looking at this woman through plexiglass to check in. But then I started having a contraction, so I had to stand up and put my hands on the back of the chair and have the contraction and then sit back down on the chair and continue. And I was so gone. I was so far gone that it didn't matter. Like nothing mattered. Propriety, the noise I was making, nothing. And I couldn't get through something that lasted longer than 3 or 4 minutes without having one. So she was very calm. She checked me in. There was this other couple there. It was only about 5 a.m. maybe at this point. There was another couple there. She was heavily pregnant. I don't know if she was in labor. She didn't seem to be laboring. They were just there. Maybe they were coming in for some sort of checkup or like they were worried about something. Maybe she was having one of those long early labors where everything was fine and calm and they just knew it was time to come in. But they were the only other people in the waiting room. So it was the two of them sitting like across the waiting room. I had finally gotten myself checked in and then I went and got on my hands and knees on some of the waiting room furniture and I was like, so loud, so animalistic. And I was just doing that for another 2 minutes and then Joe got there, thank goodness. But that's just one of my funny memories from giving birth because the woman who checked me in and then these two other people, I hope they appreciated the gravity of what was going on, but I had no shame and no moment for even wondering if I should be feeling any shame. But looking back on it, it's like, it was an amazing time. So Joe got there, a nurse came out to check me in. The next thing that had to happen was they had to check and see how dilated I was. Because if you're not, I think we all knew that it was happening, but this is the procedure. Like they check and if you're not, I can't believe I don't remember exactly what it is at this point because I feel like it was burned in my brain, but I think it might be 3 centimeters, meaning like that's how far apart your cervix has been pulled by the contractions. Your cervix has to be pulled 10 centimeters apart by the contractions for the baby to come through it. It happens in increments. It happens slowly. And if you're fewer than 3 centimeters, or I guess you would say less in this case, because it's not like it happens in 1, 2, 3 centimeters. You can be less by just a little bit rather than like, you don't just go from 3 to 2. So if you're less dilated than the 3 centimeters, they send you home because, they just don't have time for a whole bunch of people to be sitting around almost ready to start going into more active labor, especially because it can sometimes take a lot longer than you think. It can sometimes take like a whole day. So maybe that's what was going on with that other waiting room couple. Maybe they were there to see if she was dilated enough to be officially checked in. So they took me to like a triage area, took my vitals. Someone came and checked to see, and I was 5. I think I was a little more than 5 centimeters. So they were like, you're in. The whole thing was taking a lot longer than I am describing. I kind of remember because I think by the time I was officially admitted, it was like 6:30 in the morning. So because it had started around 2, at that point I'd been in labor for 4 hours, and a lot of it had been at home, which is nice. But the way that I think of it, it all just like, again, the long slide, and it was really fast. So I was having these intense contractions every couple minutes while I was sitting in that triage area and waiting. It was a long process to like get checked enough to make sure that I was dilated enough. And then they had to put an IV port, like a port on my arm or hand, so that they could plug me into an IV at a moment's notice if they needed to. And I asked them not to put me on any kind of drip because I was going for as low intervention a birth as possible. And I think the default is you get on a saline drip or something, or just for hydration. And I just was like, no, thank you. I just wanted to not be attached to anything, largely because I thought I was going to want to move around. I thought I was going to be in there laboring for hours and hours. And I thought that I was going to want to move around and be on the yoga ball and be on my hands and knees and squatting and take showers because hot water. And so it was all up in my birth plan. Like, please they have to put the port in just in case you suddenly have to go into surgery. They have to be able to like get stuff into your system basically instantly. And so they have to do it when at least at this hospital, when they do the intake, but they don't have to hook you up to anything. But I think it's a teaching hospital, but the person who was there putting the IV port in was like learning from someone, and it was she like missed the vein the first time, and I was there having contraction over contraction. She was really lovely, actually, this nurse who was like practicing putting in an IV thing. After she tried the first time, it didn't work, and I kept having contractions. The guy who was there teaching her was like telling her what to do to try again. And she, bless her heart, was like, can you do it and I'll just watch? Because I think she saw that she was like, this is not the moment to be teaching, like for me to be learning to do this. Like, can you not just put it on? And I think she was like catching I was totally out of it. I didn't even have it in me to feel or think, I can't believe this is happening. I was just there at the mercy of this, being stuck with this big thing a couple of times in my non-vein. But I think she was like, let's have a heart. And so then the expert who was there as the teacher just like, just got it stuck in. But that took a long time. And then we finally got into the room, the labor and delivery room, I think by around 6:30 in the morning, maybe getting on to 7 o'clock in the morning. Somehow I managed to put on some makeup while talking about this. I want a little more eyeshadow, I think. Oh my God, I've been filming for an hour. I hope Felix's nap is continuing on. So a wonderful, very no-nonsense labor and delivery nurse was assigned to us. She wasn't touchy-feely, but she was one of those people whose care comes through in how no-nonsense she is. Like she had the firmness and clarity that makes you feel safe instead of like a gushy, lovey, you're doing amazing type of bedside manner that I think would have also been really great in that situation. But she was a good foil to Joe being like my one other birth partner because she was so confident and so clear, and she read the birth plan straight through first thing, very focused, and she integrated all the information very quickly and was extremely dedicated to like following through in exactly the way that I had requested, which was great. Like what more could you ask for? I was saying before that labor has stages, right? There's pre-labor, which can go on for days and days, even weeks. There's early labor, which often goes on for a lot longer than my early labor went on for. That's like the long part of the hard part of labor. And then what happens is as the contractions get closer and closer, you enter this phase called the transition, where I can't remember exactly how dilated you usually are at that point, maybe 7 to 9 centimeters or something. Joe is heating up some milk for Felix because he's waking up. So you might hear the pipes running, but we're all friends here. It's fine. So I didn't know any of this about the stages of labor before, but I of course, found it fascinating when I learned about it because I was preparing to go through it. And I still just think it's really interesting. So for a lot of people, there's this very, very long time of very intense contractions getting closer and closer and closer together, often many, many hours. And then eventually, as you get close to the last stage of labor, you enter this period called the transition, where the contractions are at their very worst, very close together, and also sort of a physiological change happens, like the body kind of like starts shaking, it's just you kind of enter a portal, like it's the most intense part, and it's usually shorter. It's usually less than an hour long, the transition. It's the transition between the first part of labor, early labor, and the pushing part, where you're dilated enough that you can start pushing out the baby. It came and went so fast. Like, I don't even know. No one even said like, oh, the transition has started. I think my contractions were so intense and so close together the whole time that I just went into it. And I'm going to do cheeks with this palette. I was so still in my drugged zone, in my zone of trying to feel that I felt good in between those times of pain. In order to do it, I had to stay so shut down. And this is the crazy part. I was like a little overwhelmed by the challenge of explaining how it went from there. But I think I can do it. I'm going to do a lot of gloss and a little bit of color. So I thought I was going to want to, again, walk around, take showers, all that stuff. And here's what actually happened. I got into the room. I sat on the side of the bed with my legs dangling over the edge. No, I had one leg up. And the other dangling over. And then often I was sitting cross-legged. I was like going between. And I just stayed there. And I just like went into myself. I like went even further into myself. I was just like, I didn't want to move physically. I wanted to take in as little information as possible through my eyes and ears. And I did. I mean, the nurse had to, like, she was monitoring the baby with one of those mobile monitors. Like, they strapped a thing to me where I could get up and walk around if I needed to, because I really wanted to be able to do that. But I didn't take advantage of that because I just wanted to stay where I was, like stay put. I feel like it took every ounce of my willpower and focus and practice and like life experience to succeed at my goal of not dwelling in the pain in between contractions. So I was sitting there using everything I had to not feel bad when I wasn't in pain, to feel the feeling of being, and the way that I remember it was almost like I was falling asleep. It was like between contractions, and I wasn't actually falling asleep, definitely not, but I was almost extending my brain away, like in between, resting. It was like a resting, kind of like in the way that like a deep meditation can kind of be sort of like a falling asleep, where you have let go of everything, sort of, even the self, and you're just present but like floating. Like that's where I was going in between contractions. But I couldn't like talk to anyone while I was doing it. I couldn't make eye contact. I couldn't look around. Joe was there, right there with me. And every time I had a contraction, I would like cling to him and breathe, and he would help me breathe, and I would like breathe through it. And then I would go back to that nothingness, basically. And that was I did that for the remaining hours. And I did that, I think, through what they call the transition period. But I think that it was already so intense that it didn't really feel like a fulcrum for me, although I'm sure that the nurse knew when that was happening. And, she eventually she checked a couple times to see how dilated I was. I think she might have checked at like 7 or something, but I can't actually even remember that. What I do remember is I got to the point where I felt like I really, really felt like I needed to push. And it was like overwhelming. Like when a contraction would come, I would be like working so hard not to, because my entire body was trying so hard to bear down and push. And it's just like pushing out a poop. I mean, that's not exactly what it's like physically. That sentence is wrong. Cancel that sentence. The only thing you can equate it to, the bearing down and pushing muscularly, in terms of musculature, is that's what it feels like. But obviously it's through the entire pelvic area, and the pushing, the canal it's a different canal, and the thing that's coming out is much bigger. But it's sort of, you can kind of imagine not being able to hold back that feeling, right? But it's like not just just release. It's like a pushing coming from your muscles that you can't keep it from happening. But again, just like contractions or menstrual cramps times 1,000, it's like that times 1,000, and at the same time as a contraction. So that started happening, and the nurse checked my cervix, and I was only 9.5 centimeters, very close. But she was like, you can't push a baby out until you're 10 centimeters, so try not to push. And I was like, I can't. I was like, I can't not. It was all just happening so fast, and it was so intense, and it was just like this biological imperative. Eventually, she managed to get the doctor there. It took kind of a long time. The timing wasn't good. It was the changing of the shift, and I think because I hadn't been there for very long, I wasn't really showing up as someone who like might be about to push a baby out. And the doctors had just arrived, the next shift of doctors, and they had to like do their morning rounds and all of this stuff. And our nurse kept calling and being like, excuse me, but like this woman is like literally about to give birth, because the way it works is the labor and delivery nurse is your person until right when the baby's about to come out. And then they bring in a doctor just to like catch the baby, basically, just for the pushing part, which is the last part. So after transition, then you move into this part where you are pushing the baby out with the contractions. When the contraction happens, you're pushing. And the way this is again a thing I didn't really understand until I was preparing myself and reading Mindful Birthing. Every time you push, and I ended up pushing for like a count of 10, 3 times every time I had a contraction. And I didn't know. I hadn't taken a class. I wasn't prepared. I was just like, I've been meditating for 9 months and I read this book and that's my preparation. I thought that I was going to be moving around and that I would find a physical position that wasn't the usual one, like crouching or squatting or something, and that I would feel that that's the position I needed to be in to push, and that I would just know what to do. But instead, I didn't want to move. So it came time and she was like, do you want to get on your back? And I was like, yeah, because it was just the bed was right there. So I was like, okay, I can manage to get from sitting to lying down. And so I laid down. I was about 9.5 centimeters, trying really hard not to push. When it came time, I was on my back, and the wonderful nurse told me what to do, which was to hold on to the backs of my own knees. And then Joe held one foot and she had the other foot, like 2 stirrups. And they helped me to hike up my knees while I was pushing. The way she described it is like lifting so that the baby comes out underneath like the pelvic bone, kind of like that. So I was like pulling my knees back to push the baby out like that. And so every time I was lying on my back, every time I had a contraction, I would say, it's starting. I would tense my whole body, and they would help with pushing the feet. And then I would push really hard for a count of 10. And I would do that 3 times. And in those 30 seconds, pretty much the contraction would be over. And then I would rest and do it again. So that's what like the pushing phase is. It's just that over and over again. And if you have an epidural, I think, depending on your situation, you can kind of feel it, but you can also see on the monitor when the contraction's coming. And so you know to push then. But I really wanted to feel the urge to push. Like this is one of my main reasons. I can't remember if I ever said this back at the beginning, but I think probably primary of a handful of reasons, my primary reason for trying to get through it without medication of any kind and without an epidural was that I wanted to feel the biological imperative to push. I wanted to feel like I had to. And I wanted to be able to feel the baby coming down the birth canal, and I wanted to feel the head crowning and the baby physically sliding out of my body. I was like, if I'm going to do this, I want to feel that. I know a lot of people don't want to feel that. They want to have a baby, but they don't want to feel that. And I think that I totally respect that. And it's amazing that there's an option to do it without it being as painful as it is if you're feeling every sensation. I really wanted to experience it. And I'm so lucky that I got to. Finally, the OB came in and I was 10 centimeters and I got the green light finally to be allowed to push, which I had been dying to do. My body was like trying so hard and I couldn't really fight it. I mean, I was sort of half trying, but I couldn't really. It was happening. Let's get some blush on me. That was when, I know I'm telling it a little bit out of order now. I'm getting all kerfuffled, but that was when I got into the position that I was just describing with my legs, Then after I got the okay that I was dilated 10 centimeters and the OB was there, then with every contraction, I pushed 10 seconds 3 times in a row. And I think that was about 35 minutes. I went through that for about 35 minutes. I couldn't believe how fast it was happening. One of the interesting things, the OB hadn't really I don't think she'd read the birth plan. I think that it's like the nurse's job to convey that information or to be your point person. But the OB came in. She was so great. Really great vibes. I felt like I had to open my eyes to see what she looked like. So I was sitting there. She came in. She introduced herself. I squinted my eyes open and I was like, it's great to meet you. And she looked straight into my eyes and she said, do you want an epidural? And I was like, no. And then I closed my eyes again. And then she was like, giddy up. I mean, she didn't say giddy up, but that was the vibe. You know, she was just like, do you want an epidural? No. And then and she was like, all right, let's do it. I couldn't believe, I guess people do get it at that last phase. Like you go through all the contractions and then you get the epidural because the pain of the baby crowning that's like its own unique thing, you know, contractions, pain, that's a cramp. Whereas like the rim of the vagina, like splitting, you know, because something's being forced out of it, like that's a different kind of pain. Some people that's the thing they don't want to feel. So I understand the timing, but at the time I was just like, we made it this far. Like I was like, my reason for not wanting an epidural was to get to this point without one and to be able to go into the final phase without an epidural. So I was like, no, I absolutely don't. But of course she didn't know that. And I couldn't explain it to her. Didn't need to. All I could do was say no. This blush isn't really what I want. But I don't think I have anything here. Anything else. I'm just going to, you know what I'm going to do? Use just a little bit of concealer to kind of soften it. So the pushing started, you know, I was ecstatic. It was really hard. It's very exhausting. It's a full body prospect. It's like every muscle in your body straining to push, toning to push. After 9 months of pregnancy, like I wasn't at my best. I wasn't very toned. I didn't have, my muscles were weaker than they'd ever been, a lot of them, you know? So it's a lot. It's a real endurance trial. But I couldn't believe that the baby was going to be here soon. Like I remember this moment when the nurse, she had checked me and she was like, it's probably just going to be another hour or something and then it'll be baby time. And I just remember in the fog of drugs being like, oh my God, it's going to be baby time. Time to push out the baby. Like I was just elated. I was I was on the drugs of my body, but I was just like, I felt so fortunate. I couldn't believe that most of it was behind me, you know, and that it was like happening and that I was doing it. It especially the transition to pushing and then the part where I was pushing the baby out. I remember so distinctly just being like, I can't believe this isn't taking longer and that it's not harder. It just felt so possible. And again, like my body really knew what to do. And one of the things I was determined to do because of what I had read was to like let the body take over. I think one of the wisest things I had written in my cheat sheet for myself was like, you don't have to do anything to like get the baby out. You don't have to do anything. You just have to let go of the feeling that you might need to control what's happening and let your body do what it knows how to do and support it kind of in that by letting go of control with your mind. And that's kind of how I felt at that time. I felt so lucky and I felt so strong. Like I remember just feeling like I really can do this, you know? So I pushed during every contraction for what felt like a really short time to me. What I learned later was about half an hour. And partway through, they started being able to see the baby's head. So this is what I learned from mindful birthing is every time you push the baby a little bit further down. And then when you stop pushing, it slides back up a little. And then you push again in the next contraction. And then when you stop pushing, it slides back up a little. And so it's like this incremental process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, pushing over the course of however long it takes. For me, it was 30 or 40 minutes. Over the course of those 30 or 40 minutes, I was pushing him further and further down the birth canal. But the birth canal is not like long. Like long, you know, it's just that long. And so it's like, as soon as he started doing that, the crown of his head started coming out and Joe and the nurse could see his head and they could see his hair. And I remember the nurse saying like, oh, he's a redhead, which remains to be seen. But I was just like, holy shit. Like, I couldn't believe that, like, it was already happening and that his head was in the world. The top of his head was in the world, like, could be seen. And that Joe could see our baby's head. Like, I just couldn't believe it. And it was so a thing that had been loomed so large and been so terrifying and that I'd worked so hard to prepare myself for, which was like giving birth, that I was doing it and I was happening, that I was capable of it, and that it was towards the end. Like that pushing part was magical, actually. And I'm so grateful. I mean, I know that a lot of birth stories are traumatic, and I was fully prepared for a lot to be really challenging and things not to go the way that I'd hoped. I feel so lucky that I can look back on it and say that part it's such a good memory. Anyway, I can't remember if I started pushing before the OB got there. I think I did. I think she came in and said I could push and then maybe left for a while. I can't remember. It's a bit of a blur. But she was there at the end, obviously. I think there was some concern that his shoulder would get stuck because he was coming down sort of sideways. So at the last minute, they called in like a team of other OBs just in case, and like for right when he came out, because the OB was a little bit worried. It was all, I didn't really register at the time, but I learned later that there had been like 5 people standing around her as she caught the baby, and then Joe and the nurse like there, and they were all on point. And then as soon as his head came out, I remember so clearly, I couldn't believe it. It's like, I think I thought it was going to hurt worse, or I don't know. I felt, yeah, I could feel it. I could feel myself pushing out his head as I got to the end. And as soon as his head came out, they were like, heads out, heads out. And then I took one more breath and another huge, hard, long push, and his shoulders and the rest of his body slid out. And that was it. And I just was like, I can't believe I did it. I can't believe it. And then those 5 people just like promptly disappeared and went off to deliver their own babies. They were like there just right to make sure that everything was okay. Joe told me this later. And I don't know, the rest is history. I've been filming for a really long time, and so I kind of need to go. I'm hoping to do a new Makeup Hot Takes video, and I also need to like go feed Felix and all of this stuff. I'll put on a lip product and the earrings, and I won't just leave you hanging, because I know that was then the baby was born, and like that's the best part. But to me, it's all that came before. That is the birth story, the labor and delivery story. The fact that contractions progressed so quickly. There wasn't even time for Joe to bring the yoga ball in from the car, let alone for me to sit on it. And it was really hot the next day, and it popped in the trunk because the heat expanded. There wasn't time for him to read the poems. There just wasn't time for any of what we had planned, which is a blessing. You know, like if there was going to be one crazy thing about it, I would want it to be that it went really fast, because there was no time for me to question whether or not I should get an epidural, or there was no time for me to get pulled out of myself by the wildness of the experience. It just head down, focus, went into it, and then it just went. So I was very lucky. I feel we were very lucky in that was the aberration. It was, especially for a first baby, it ended up being a total of 8 hours, maybe a little longer than 8 hours, which is just quite short for a first baby. And that if I could have picked, that's what I would have picked. Although it was over so quickly, and there was the strangeness of having prepared for it to be this. There was like a specialness about the plans of like reading the poetry and all of this stuff. I was anticipating being in the hospital in labor in this much more present way, or a different kind of presence, you know, and it just all went out the window. So that expectation it is what they all say, like prepare yourself, but then prepare for your expectations to be shattered. And in a way they were, it's just they weren't shattered in a traumatic way, which I think is what happens to a lot of people. I like these earrings, but I don't know about the black sweater. I mean, coral and black isn't really my thing, but I think I will keep them on for new Makeup Hot Takes, and I might just change my top. And I do feel like they go with Merit Marrakesh and with the cheek. I do feel like it all kind of goes together. So Felix was born. Joe says that when his head popped out, all the rest of the amniotic fluid came out. So my water had broken way back at the very beginning of labor, but his head was plugging the dam the entire time. As soon as his head came out, all the rest of it came out. Isn't that funny? So it all came gushing out. Felix came out. They put him straight on me. I mean, I wanted to do skin to skin for as long as possible. So there was a little bit during the first 3 hours, a little bit of like cleaning him up, taking his, not like bathing him, but just like getting him together, measuring and weighing him and all of that stuff. You know, I tried to keep him on me for the vast majority of the minutes of his first several hours of life. My sister happened to arrive like 5 minutes after he was born, which they found out, I think, when they woke up around 7 that morning. They got Joe's texts, which he was barely able to send because the contractions were so thick and fast, and he was spending most of the time like right there with me. But in between, he managed to like send off a couple of texts. And so the text chain, I learned later, was kind of like, oh, Hannah's in labor. Oh, it's kind of happening sort of fast. And Ellie was like, oh, I'll come as fast as I can. But by the time, I mean, she basically woke up, found out I was in labor, drove over. And by the time she got to the room, Felix had just been born. I was holding him, and I was sitting there with my legs up in the stirrups, and the OB was stitching me up. And that was when Ellie came in, which is actually perfect, because she got to be there for the amazing like 2 to 3 hours after the baby is born, during which I don't know how usual this is. I think, though, that all babies are different, but I think that it is a pretty usual experience for those first couple hours for the baby to be very alert, eyes open and really looking around and taking everything in. And he totally was. I mean, he totally recognized Joe from his voice. And when he saw Joe and saw him talking, he was just, you could just see him like taking it all in. I mean, he really, really was connected, with Joe, which was great because Joe spent a lot of time talking to him when he was in there, and me. And my sister later, she was like, he totally recognized you guys. Like, she was right there to see him recognizing us, but seeing us with his eyes for the first time. It was so cool. I tried to get him to nurse. I feel like I'm out of time, but I don't know when I'll have another opportunity to say this. Nursing has been so hard. He is good suction and has the ability to latch. It's my shape, like the shape of my body isn't super conducive or wasn't super conducive to nursing. I have like flat nipples, full disclosure, or I had. I think he, over the course of the past 3 months, has basically restructured my tissue of my body by nursing. And now it's much easier and everything's going fine. But it has been so painful. And also stressful, worrying if he's getting enough to eat. Again, I need to cut that story short, but what I will say is that I tried to get him to eat a little bit there at the beginning, and he tried, but it was going to take so much longer than that for us to get to the place where we could do that. So from almost the beginning, there's been a lot of pumping of milk and feeding him of milk separately and a mix of me. I've been able to feed him just from my milk, but I haven't been able to do it all directly from me. I've had to pump out milk and feed it to him separately because it's just been hard for him, especially when he's really tiny, to get enough of a good latch on me to be able to eat enough milk to be able to grow. And it's especially been hard for him to do that efficiently. So for the first couple of months, I'll just say this briefly, I just felt like all I did was feed him. I spent so many hours a day trying to feed him, and it was so painful the entire time. They say if your baby has a good latch, it won't hurt. I'm here to tell you that is not true, because he has had a good latch the whole time. It just hurt me so much because it took a really long time for my body to get used to that, to get numb to it basically, or to restructure enough so that he can do what he needs to do to eat, and it isn't excruciatingly painful. And it's interesting, it's different. Labor is very painful, but it's this broad body experience of an ache and a cramp and a full body, high level pain. It's very different from this sharp, localized, excruciating pain, like a razor nick or a bee sting on the nipples, which are so sensitive, that goes on for hours and hours, for days, and then for weeks on end, and that you have to subject yourself to in order to feed your child. So it's this demented thing. The pain of that and the trial of that was, for me, harder and had much more darkness in it. There were more dark days and dark times in that than there were in labor and delivery. For me, it was the one went absolutely spectacularly beautiful, and then the other was a real challenge. And so that's where the story leaves off. That was the beginning of that challenge. Although, of course, the most of it is just that it's so amazing to have the baby on the outside, right? It's just amazing. See what his little face looked like and his little personality, which has really been emerging since that very first moment. His little chin looks just like Joe's chin, and to be able to hold him in our arms and sing to him and talk to him. It's just, and have him look back and have him, it's just spectacular. I actually feel now I'm exhausted, and also how can you describe, what began at that moment? How can I really just say it in a couple sentences, Yeah, I'm spent. I can't go on. That's the birth story. I didn't know I was going to tell you the birth part of the story in such detail. I didn't know that I was going to go on for so long. I'm going to go. Okay, y'all, that is it. I cannot believe you're still here. You made it through. I will put some links in the description box down below, some links to the books that I mentioned. Maybe I'll find a way to link my actual birth plan so that you can use it as a template for your own if that's something that you need. And I am going to add to the description box some donation links through which you can provide direct aid to people giving birth and caring for newborns in emergency situations and in the midst of humanitarian crises. Please consider donating. As always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching this one. And don't forget to take extra good care of yourself so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.
I think we got it.